Good evening, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for another event of the B&H virtual event space here. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, Mr. David Cardinal, who will be talking about wildlife photography. The event is brought to you by our wonderful sponsors, Western Digital and Synology. We thank you very much. We've got Pete here from Western Digital. I'm going to hand off the mic to him. If you have any questions, please feel free to get them in and we will answer them as they come.
All right. Thank you, Scott. As Scott said, my name is Pete Isgrig. I'm with Western Digital, and we are really excited to be here today with David Cardinal. So for him to talk about his wildlife photography, give you guys some tips and tricks of this field, and to talk to you about how he uses our products and Synology products within his workflow, how it's better because of that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Cardinal. David, take it away.
Great, thanks. I'm happy to be here virtually. I've been to the presented at the event space many times, but the first time over Zoom. So I wish everybody well out there, and I can't see your shiny faces, but I know they're there. I'm sure there's some return visitors. In any case, there's a lot to cover around wildlife photography. I'm going to do kind of an A to Z thing and encourage questions where we can dig deeper in different pieces of it. There's so much that we can't go through everything today, but I've been a professional wildlife photographer for 2 decades now, and a hobbyist wildlife photographer since I was a kid, which is a lot more decades than that. So I've been doing this and teaching this for a while, and I'll go through again from A to Z. So let's get started. Thanks to Western Digital and Synology for sponsoring, and of course for B&H for hosting. What I want to talk about today is a variety of topics. First of all, getting to know yourself, which is more important than people realize. We'll talk about gearing up for wildlife photography, some tips and tricks about how to learn the trade, how to do things right, how to make a great photo, about animal behavior, about workflow, which is of course where Synology and Western Digital come in. And I actually didn't put any slides in on ethics, but I'll talk about them a little bit. And there'll be plenty of pictures interspersed. Great. Now, if we were here in person, there'd be this awe-inspiring music and the next few slides would play, but I've been warned that that doesn't work over Zoom. So I'm just going to flip through them just to set the mood. This is dawn on the Okavango Delta.
This isn't the song from The Lion King starting right now. It's not that big chant that happens right now. That wasn't the music track.
No, it's actually, the Soweto Gospel Choir does an amazing song out of Africa. That's just, I can't get enough of it, but if you ever want to look up the Soweto Gospel Choir from Johannesburg, they do some amazing stuff.
Awesome.
A little lion next to the truck, zebra mom, leopard. Leopards spend a lot of their time in trees unhappy because the hyenas during the day will come and just pester them. So if they kill something, they've got to get it out of the way. So this guy's looking down at the hyena that's got his kill, her kill actually. This is Lacodemo, which is the leopard that the Jouberts filmed in that documentary about the leopard, Eye of the Leopard, or whatever they call it. More lions. Drinking is always a good thing. Reflections are a good thing. Slice of life. Everybody wants to see a kill in Africa until they see one. And then they usually don't want to see another one. So they're usually happier with these sort of like, mood pieces of, okay, he's eating his ribs at the barbecue joint. Little activity. So there's lots you can do. These little guys need to cross the water and they're really unhappy about it. And that's him being unhappy crossing the water. And even the hyenas are pretty cool, the little pups. Some wild dogs, and there's Lacodema again. And that's just a fox. Oh, and there are bears from Alaska. But at any rate, let's get on with it. Oh, lightning. If you have a lightning trigger or a trigger and you go any place with lightning, it's a great thing to do when you're not photographing animals.
David, typically, how far away are you from most of these animals when you're shooting them? Like those photos you just showed us, how far feet-wise or yard-wise?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. It depends entirely on the setting. Um, if we're working on the ground, you're not going to get anywhere near a lion, for example, typically, or you shouldn't. In the vehicles, we don't approach too closely, but the lions will often come up or past us. So we'll try and position the vehicle in such a way that we know maybe they're going to go to drink after they've killed something, and they might come right along the vehicle. So they might just be a few feet away or next to it or lay down under it. Um, with birds, obviously, it's tough to get close to them unless you're in a blind. So really, that's part of the experience. And typically, the more you pay, in some ways, if you're going on a safari like to Africa, if you use that money to buy access, you can get closer and closer to the animals by being in a private reserve where you can off-road as opposed to a national park where you're stuck on the roads and therefore you need more telephoto. So that's one reason to go with somebody who knows what they're doing, is to try and figure all that out, because you don't know till you get there usually the first time, like, oh, wait, I didn't know we couldn't off-road here. So we're 100 yards away from the animals, stuff like that. So we're going to talk about knowing yourself, which I think is the most important thing. And it comes up in terms of what you just said. What's your goal when you go? Do you really want to like turn into a Franz Lonting, in which case you've got a long road ahead? Or do you want to just get some great photos, or you want to see the animals and have some memories? Because you can get really obsessed, and people do, with the photography, and they stop enjoying the experience. Like, even if your camera's not working, if you're out with wildlife, you're out with wildlife, and it's a pretty good day at the office. So I think a lot of people stress out too much, and they worry too much, and they worry they're going to be compared to other people, and they don't have the right lens, or they don't have the right filter. And it's like, it's okay. It's also not clear what you want out of it. Do you want 3 pictures for your office wall? Do you want 30 pictures to show your friends? Do you want 1 picture to show your club and win a contest? So think about what you're out there for. Just like if you're going to play golf, are you out there to become a scratch golfer, or you just enjoy going out and hitting the ball? A lot of my clients just enjoy being outdoors, and this is a great way to get outdoors and a good excuse to do it. Taking really good wildlife photographs takes a lot of discipline and a long attention span. Even on a high-end safari, it takes a certain amount of waiting for things to happen. And we'll get a lot of that where, clients will get really nervous, like, oh, it's walking away from us. Like, well, we're not going to follow a cat, a lion or a leopard or a cheetah for a number of reasons. One is it's annoying to them. And the other one is you're going to get a lot of the same shots of the tail. So we might go around and position the vehicle someplace, and maybe it's a 50-50, they go that way. So 50-50, we get a nice shot of them coming towards us, and 50-50, we get nothing. Whereas if we follow them, we have a 100% chance of a shot of the tail, which isn't very exciting after the first 200 of them. And it is wildlife, so you can't always predict or ever predict entirely what they're going to do. But it can be a lot of fun. I'm out with a group, including my daughter, who's playing Sherpa for photographing some clamming bears up in Alaska that we do every year, which is pretty fun. And that's an example. We don't go too close to those bears on our own, but we let them get fairly close to us. But it's in the open. We've got a bear guide. We've been doing it. I've been doing it for 21 years. They've been doing it for 35 years. The bears are very acclimated. This is not something you're going to do in Yellowstone, or it's not something you're going to do in Denali. That bear would either be coming at you or running. So it all depends on the situation. In terms of gear, there really isn't any wrong gear anymore. We used to say, oh, you need a big SLR and then a DSLR and a big long lens. But really the gear has gotten so good that you can shoot. I even have a whole article I did on shooting a safari with a smartphone. I don't recommend it necessarily, but I wanted to show what you could do with just that one tool on a safari, and even that's possible. And it's not just your budget. A lot of people think, oh, I want the more expensive lens. But especially if you don't work with it before you get in the field, that can be a really bad idea. And I'll give you an example. I had a 600 f4, which weighed 12 pounds. And then I got this 200 to 400 that weighs 8 pounds. And boy, I've shot all over the world with it. It's an amazing lens. I love it. I'm now at the point where just as likely as not, I might take my Sigma 150 to 600. That's about half the size and half the weight of the other one, because I can, and it's pretty darn good. And it actually has a little more range without having to switch to a teleconverter. So, my $8,000 lens might stay in the office. So it depends. There's also some super lightweight, super expensive lenses out now, which I refuse to spend the money for. Plus, you've got to make sure you can take it with you. We get a lot of clients who come out in the field and they go, "Oh, I have to carry this stuff." It's like, well, they're bears and they're wandering around and they're not going to like come pose for you. So yes, we have to do that. Or now on a driving vehicle safari in Africa, you might be on the vehicle, but you still have to manipulate and handle the gear, and the truck's going to be bumping up and down. And if you're switching lenses or messing with two cameras, when something happens, you're not going to get any images. So we'll talk a little bit about gear. Point and shoots are kind of falling out of favor again, but for a while there were some pretty good, well, there still are some very good telefocal or zoom point and shoots, or medium fixed lens cameras like the Sony RX. I guess they're up to 5 now or something. Or the R, they've got the little one, which is really nice, and then they've got the little bigger one. It's a pretty good compromise if you don't want to be messing with changing lenses. And a number of people, not so much my clients, but people who are just going to Africa or just going to Alaska, just want one thing to take. So a fixed lens camera can work pretty well. I would make sure to get one that has raw mode and changeable white balance, but some people don't even mess with that. If you're looking for a camera to do serious wildlife photography, full frame is going to give you better wide angle, but it's going to take a little longer lens to get the same crop factor. Build quality to me is really important, because the last thing you want is for your camera to fall off a bench somewhere and you're out for the count for the rest of the trip, or have it freeze. I find it's easier to handle a camera if you have the option of going vertical. I'd show you my camera, except I'm using it as a webcam. But I've kind of gotten used to not having that. So it depends, but having that vertical grip where you can shoot portrait mode and still have a shutter button up here can be nice. I like frame rate. I feel really bad with anything below 6 frames a second. Ideally 8 or more. It's not so hard to get that these days. It used to be kind of a trade-off. Fast focus is critical to me. I almost always shoot in autofocus. And maybe I twiddle a little bit on the lens, but focus speed is really important. So that's something I look at. And then ergonomics. One reason I shoot Nikon is I find them to be like a sports car. I know where all the controls are, maybe because I've been shooting with them forever, or maybe because they're in the right place. I find them very easy and quick to work with. Like the Sony mirrorless are amazing cameras, but I always struggle with the controls on them. If I was starting today, I would probably go Sony mirrorless at this point, unless Nikon does something pretty stunning this year. They just haven't kept up in the mirrorless, which is where all the action is happening now. I love all my Nikon gear. I'm not selling it. I'm not changing anytime soon, but I wish they would like accelerate their pace of evolution a little bit. Lenses, you don't need a ton. People tend to take too much stuff, and the more stuff you take, the more confusing it gets. And if you need something as a backup, great, but then leave it in your hotel room or your lodge room or your tent or whatever. The more stuff you have with you when you're trying to shoot, the more likely you're going to get confused or grab the wrong thing or make the wrong setting. More photographs are probably ruined by people accidentally having the wrong setting on their camera, which I'll talk about a little bit. I try and leave my camera setup as simple as possible, because the last thing you want to do when that bear just pops out of the woods is try and remember how your camera is set and reset it. So like everything you put in a manual mode is something you got to unput in a manual mode or change every time you turn around or the lighting changes. So simpler, believe it or not, can be better as long as you know what you're doing. So I take typically a general zoom, like a 24 to 70. I don't take the Nikon 24 to 70 because it's huge. So I take the Tamron, the one I'm using right now is my webcam. If I'm going someplace with great scenics, I'll take a 12 to 24. I've got the Sigma 12 to 24. Fast lenses are better, but they're bigger and heavier. So it's a matter of trading off. Like for an action zoom, I tend to take a 70 to 200 f2.8, or even now I'm the 4 because it's lighter because I'm getting lazier. And then for long, obviously, you probably need 400 millimeters or more for any kind of wildlife. 600 typically for birds. That could be with a teleconverter or whatever. And that's kind of your big gun. I'm not going to go into much detail on accessories. Tripods, I don't think I have a slide in here on this, but tripods are kind of misunderstood when it comes to wildlife. People think, oh, I can handhold my lens and therefore I don't need a tripod. Well, for me, the problem is not that I can't handhold. I can handhold any of these for a while. The problem is I can't handhold them indefinitely. So a mother bear, for example, might nurse for 15 to 20 minutes, and then she sits up. And the instant she sits up is a really nice shot. And that's going to last about 3 seconds. So I can guarantee you, if you're out there for 15 to 20 minutes, you're not going to be holding that 200 to 400 or that 400 2.8 like this for that long. You're going to put it down at your side. And then that bear is going to sit up, and you've got 2.5 seconds to get the camera up to your eye, focus, and take the picture if you're lucky. Whereas if you've got a tripod, you can have it set to where you want to look at, and you're ready to go, and it takes a half a second to press the button. So for me, tripods are for waiting. It doesn't mean you need one. Monopods, tripods, it's up to you. It just, that's kind of what they give you, is the ability to preset on the scene and be patient and relax your arms and then swing into action instead of having to always be moving things around. Flash doesn't work very well on big mammals. It works really well on small mammals, kangaroo rats. I've never photographed meerkats at night, so I don't know, but it works very well on birds. And then typically I tend to use just bean bags in the trucks. A lot of people try and use a big clamp and make like a machine gun turret. I don't find that very flexible because something inevitably happens over there and then you're stuck. So I just like to squish around and use my knee in bean bags. Teleconverters, of course, rain covers, depending on where you go. I love a pair of pocket binoculars. I should have brought them down here to show you. I have the same pair of Leicas I've had for 25 years, but most birders and all, and I have a big pair for birding, but having a pair of pocket binoculars that fit right in this pocket is really great for seeing what's going on, and they don't get in the way, whereas a bigger pair is like one more thing to carry. So here's what I have. I kind of already talked through most of this. The D850 I still think is the best camera in many ways on the planet for this stuff. These days, if you were buying again, you could get the new, Z6 or Z7 Mark II, but I'm not going to spend the money on that when I have the D850, not yet anyway. And we talked about lenses. Another thing to check is what you can take on with you. International carry-on limits, regional carrier limits. A lot of carriers post really low carry-on limits, but they don't enforce them. So it's kind of like a stressful part of every trip is like, okay, how much do I think I can get on the plane? And if I can't get it on the plane, what are they going to make me do to it? And is it going to survive? So there's a trade-off. The less you take, the more likely you are to be able to get it with you on the plane. But if it's in a soft-sided case, then that's not so great maybe. If you do check things, it can get stolen. Pelican cases get stolen the most. So even though they're the most secure way to carry your gear, they, in my experience, are the most likely to get stolen on international flights. And a lot of photographers have had that happen. Africa, for example, the charter planes have very tight limits. We always get extra space on the plane for our people, same for Alaska. So that's something to think about if you go on a non-photo trip. Are they really going to let you bring your photo gear, or is that going to be a problem for you? And working in whatever the space is, whatever kind of vehicle or in the field, or like the bears were out in the mud and the sand. So you want something you don't have to set down ideally. So I carry a sling bag that I can bring around like this and work with right here instead of having to take a backpack off and set it in the mud. And then another big thing is, I've had people literally drop ship brand new cameras in the box from B&H to Alaska. And when they get there, unpack them all and set them up and start learning them. And it's like, okay, well, you spent a lot of money to get here. You might not even have the right stuff. You really want to check it out in advance. And there's lots of ways to do that, which we'll talk about. But you really want to make sure everything's working. We've had people where their zoom lenses, like the Canon push-pull 100 to 400, used to get really soft between 300 and 400. Some of them did. And we had people come to Africa with it and get all pissed off after day one and think their camera was broken and they didn't know. And we'd put a bunch of beer bottles on the wall and shoot. And we, at different focal lengths, and it was clear it was just soft in the last 100 millimeters, but they didn't know that. And, they could have done something before, and now they were limited on that lens. I also think you really want to know how to do stuff with your gear. I say in the dark, basically, because for me, I photograph with contact lenses on, so I can't actually see up close very well. So I actually can't read half the controls on the camera anyway. But I know where they all are and I know how to use them without pulling out reading glasses. And everybody really should be able to do that, because you want to be watching the subject and not looking down and having to mess with your camera any more than you need to, because you're missing shooting time. You might be missing the action. So I think practice with that. And like when I'm in the field with clients, I'm always there to answer questions. But if I've tried to give 2 days worth of advice, and then suddenly when that mother bear is sitting up from nursing, somebody says, how do I change my f-stop again? It's like, well, this is not really the best time to be asking. It's a good question to know before you have to do that and have thought about it ideally. And it's something you learn, and that's what it takes practice. Yeah, test everything. This is another test we do, and there's actually Datacolor makes a tool that makes this a little easier, a little ruler thing. But basically, one of the things that people find is sometimes camera and lens combinations might back focus or front focus compared to where they think. So we'll put a bunch of stuff like this. These are lacquerware bowls from Burma up on a fence at different distances and focus on the one, in this case, that's upside down, and look at the image to see if that's what's sharpest. And if it's not, in the old days, you were kind of screwed. And now there are all these little micro focus adjustments on most of the cameras where you can tweak that. And it can change with different focal lengths and different distances. But again, you can get really frustrated by going out in the field and having an image that's soft and not knowing why. And it's hard to get the animals to repeat their performance. So you really need your own set of diagnostic tools like this to try and debug, okay, what's going wrong? Why is this soft? What if I take a high-speed picture of a static object and it's soft, then motion is not my problem, would be a good example. Oh, and practice image workflow. I've had another issue where we've had people bring cameras that they set to RAW to Africa. In a lot of places there's no internet connectivity once you get out in the bush, and they didn't have a RAW converter that worked with their RAW files, so they couldn't look at any of our images. Stuff like that. I mean, it's just good to get everything working before you go and test it. And we'll talk more about workflow. Yeah, use your gear. Backyard birding. I mean, everybody can put a bird feeder somewhere. And if you don't have backyard birds, then photograph cars going by. Photo tag is a great game that I think I invented 25 years ago with our daughter, who was about 25 years younger in that picture, which is works even for grandparents. You got your grandkids running around, and they want you to play with them. So the deal is, you take out your camera, your lens, and you say, here's the deal. I'm going to get a sharp picture of you, and you're going to try and move around so quickly that I can't. And it's really fun. You take the picture and say, I got one. And they come over and look and go, no, it's not sharp. My hand's moving or whatever. So it's a great game. It's a great way to test your gear. Zoos. A couple times with B&H, we did photo walks at the Bronx Zoo, which were really fun. But obviously you can do that on your own. It's a great way to learn about the animals you're going to photograph. Obviously, they're in a different setting, well, some similar setting, but you get some of the same backgrounds. The good zoos like the Bronx Zoo do a really good job of that. So you can get a sense for the animals, the exposure, all that sort of thing. Yeah, sort it out before you get there, and don't read too much on the web because you'll get confused. Yeah, we talked about this. So as far as, okay, now we're there. We've got Ollie Otter here, you know, and we want to take his picture. Light is the first thing to think about, and you can't always control it except by the time of day you go out and the direction you face. So the golden light is sunrise and sunset. The one thing about Alaska is it can last a long time because it's a high latitude, so the sun's low in the sky. So the golden light in the evening could be 2 hours, whereas at the equator, it might be 20 minutes. And here's an example of what a difference it makes. Here's a tree of open-billed storks that I took in Botswana. This is a long time ago, this is film. But then I found another one at sunset, and it looks like this. And you can see it's a remarkable difference. And the only real, I mean, it's a slightly different tree, but the big difference is just the time of day and the lighting. Overcast doesn't have to be bad. This is heard a waterbuck in a pouring rainstorm in the Chobe region of Botswana. The sky is going to be ugly, so you want to crop as much of it out as you can, but you get some pretty saturated colors when you've got that overcast light, as long as you can deal with the overcast. And if you're doing birds, that's a good time for flash fill to add some color to the birds. Cameras are amazing, so don't be afraid to experiment. This is when Moose Peterson and I first got our D1s, Sandhill cranes. It's like after sunset. We have like the first digital cameras ever. Like, oh, what happens when we set it to fluorescent white balance and take pictures after the sun goes down? And like, oh, that's pretty cool. So don't be afraid to play with the camera too. Harsh daylight is rude by most people, R-U-E-D, but it has its advantage. This is dead flay and Sosa's flay, where it only rains about once every 20 years. And by the time you get there, it's going to be bright almost, because you can't get into the park before sunrise. And we did some other stuff. And then by the time you get back to here, this is what it looks like. I used a polarizing filter, and that darkens the sky up here, but also has the advantage of cutting the glare. In fact, if you photograph midday, polarizing filters can be really helpful and kind of a cheat to make it look a little less like it's midday. But you can make it work for you. This is in the Linyanti in Botswana, and again, midday, but I kind of made the pictures about that. This is a jackal, and he's found the only spot of shade, like in his acre. So he's there with his tongue hanging out, and you can see the bright light. So it kind of gives you part of a story, which could be a whole other talk about wildlife photography. We're trying to tell a story. Same here with the elephant. Oh, same with this lion underneath the camel thorn acacia tree. Yeah, it's pretty fun. This was shot with, oh, I don't even know what. This is so long ago, but this is Okavango, that flay. So for animals, there's also the way you use the light on the animal. The front lit gives you the best overall definition. This is a desert adapted elephant in Namibia. It has extra long legs and bigger feet because they have to walk 20 or 30 miles to get to water. And that's your most common shot. That's kind of like your shot of record. But if I take that same, well, not exactly the same elephant, same species, and I shoot it side lit, I get a lot more texture and definition and depth. So I can see, here I can see all the detail. Here I can see more depth and texture, and it's a more unusual way to shoot. And then backlit, a lot of people go, oh, I really want to make those cranes look right. And it's never going to look right if you try and expose for the cranes, because it's going to turn white, and it's not worth it. So think shapes and patterns. And that's one of the things for backlit is you're shooting for different things, reflections, textures in the water. So here's examples of this pelican. Just here's front lit, here's side lit. This is the one I would put in a bird book. This is the one I might put on my wall or whatever. And then of course, just the backlit stuff. Backgrounds, in some ways I look for the background first, because sometimes those can be harder to change. Like if you're looking at a herd of animals and you want to pick one to focus on, find one that's in a place where you can get a good background. So you're going to want to get contrast with the background, ideally. And then you can control how much the background blurs by setting your aperture. And the wider open your aperture, the narrower the depth of field, the more the blur. That's something it's probably even good to practice in advance, again, with your little beer cans or whatever on the wall. Take your telephoto out and pretend it's a bird or pretend it's a bear and use different apertures and see how much you get that's sharp. So here's examples of contrasting backgrounds. This tree frog's on a reed, and I had the advantage, I was able to hold the reed in one hand, like one hand while shooting with the other hand. Of course, I'm in a canoe, so it's a little tricky. So I'm trying to move the reed up and down with that hand and then shoot and get him. He's only about an inch long. Trying to get a picture of him against a smooth background. Or this oriole, he was all over in the trees, but finding a place where he's got a smooth background. This caracara against the blue sky, of course, that's always a classic. Subjects, so shape, color, how exciting are they? What are they doing? The good news about wildlife photography is it's pretty easy to have a subject usually, because you've got an animal, and with any luck, the animal has eyes. Like in landscape photography, it can be a little difficult to make sure things are exciting, but if you've got a lion cub sitting there staring at you, it's not really that hard to like figure out what the subject is. Now, you might want to make sure you keep the whole paw in the picture. You might want to decide where you want to put the eye. And that eye is actually sharp enough. If you zoomed in on this, you could see me in our vehicle. So that's how sharp really that sort of thing should be if you're focused exactly and you have good gear. With wildlife, the other thing is people will tend to follow the gaze of the animal. So if there's something they're looking at, that's always a good thing. There is the classic portrait shot, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you have a great background, you've got your basic, oh God, it's not a kudu, it's a sable, I think. Or you just have interaction in the scene. They're not looking at me, but she's looking at her cub, and then the cub's kind of looking at the truck behind us or whatever. So you've got something going on there. There's a lot of ground rules about placing the subject that people talk about, the rule of thirds and all this stuff. But the truth is, I think it's important just to make something interesting. And a typical, a really good example that, and it's fair to do, is if you're shooting birds that are a ways off, and all you have is blue sky, you might as well just stick them in the middle on your center autofocus point, because it's the fastest autofocus point. And then when you get it back on your computer, start different croppings and see what you think is interesting and sort of learn what you like. And then when you have something closer, you can go, okay, I remember that framing. I think that was the interesting framing. So you can learn for yourself what matters to you, which I think is the most important thing. I'm not too into what other people think at camera clubs. And if you want to submit to editors, that's a whole different hour and a half we'll have to spend, because that's a whole different deal. So I think, you know, what you like is really the most important thing. And mostly people tend to put stuff in the middle, and that tends not to be the most interesting place. So learn how to either refocus or use AF points to try and get things out of the middle somehow. These are a couple bald eagles. In Homer, Alaska, there was a woman, Jean Keene, who used to feed them up there. And for 20 years, every single really good bald eagle picture, including the one on the post office truck, came from her backyard, which is a junkyard of RVs and caravans. But you would never know it because she threw the salmon out by the water. And then the town passed an ordinance saying nobody was allowed to do it once she passed away, because it was getting to be kind of a spectator sport. But it was fun while it lasted. Yeah, here's what I'm talking about. What matters is keeping people's interest, not being boring. Let's see, this gets recorded, right? So people can come back and look at the details later. Okay, cool. So I don't have to you don't have to take notes. I don't have to rattle it off. But most of the conventional wisdom is only conventional wisdom until somebody changes it, or if it's conventional for too long, then it gets boring, and people change about every decade anyway. Another example of why composition matters, and I think this is a lesson I learned indirectly from Moose Peterson, because a lot of people would complain about the Nikon metering, and Moose is like, it works great. I'm like, okay, how come it always works great for him and it doesn't always work great for these other people? And I realized it's because he composed his images correctly and gave the meter a chance. because the meter doesn't really know what you want to do. And they're getting smarter and they've got AI in them and this and that. But at the end of the day, you're better off giving them a chance. And here's an example. This image is slightly underexposed. You could spot meter on the bird, which is a pain in the neck. You could dial in plus a third, which is not so hard. You could shoot raw and fix in Photoshop, maybe it's okay. Or you could just compose with the bird someplace in the scene that blocks out the bright sky, and the camera is going to take care of it for you, because it's not having to fight between the bright sky and the darker bird and try and guess what you meant. It's going, hey, I've got this. You've given me a scene I can handle and make everything look good. So composition, here's a couple pyroloxia, just showing a couple of my favorite poses, and I can never decide, this is the classic one, but I kind of like the one turned back on itself. And if you're shooting, especially speaking of shooting for editorial, you want to shoot both. You want to shoot a lot of different things, because inevitably you get a photo query saying, we need a horizontal in this kind of tree of this kind of bird, and et cetera, et cetera. And they used to send those out in want lists, and now it's all on the web and they do a little, query, but same kind of idea. Ears are really important. And this is one reason when I talk about you don't want to make your camera too complicated. This is one reason why not. You want to be paying attention to the subject. You want the ears either both forward or worst or second best back. You don't want them separate. So you want to be paying attention. I like to keep the paws in the image. I hate it when they're cropped off, but not everybody cares. I like to leave room for the rest of the legs when I photograph birds in water. Tails, every time we see our first leopard in Africa, I have to yell at people, remember the tail. They're like, oh crap, the tail's really long. It's like, yes, it's still really long. And if you crop off the tail, it's like not so much fun. So not that you can't do a head portrait, but another rule of thumb is when a big mammal starts to come towards me and I can see both shoulders, that's when I tend to go vertical and frame it like a portrait. If you go vertical when it's sideways, you just cut off half the back of the animal and it almost never looks right. Eye contact. I was playing with my lens caps when these leopard cubs were up in the tree, and this one came down and I was looking up going, hey, can I play with those lens caps too? So in this case, I'm 3.5 feet from that leopard cub. I mean, it's directly below where I'm seated in the vehicle. Mom was off hunting, so they were left at home to play. Ducks, put them high in the water. This was the same place I photographed those wild dogs, but I looked up and this yellow-billed kite was taking stuff. Same thing, this is a lion kill, but I looked around and found this jackal taking food when the lions weren't looking. With birds, a lot of times it's easier to anticipate where they're going to land and focus on it rather than try and track them. With herds like these baboons, we always look around for the little pink ears, the little tiny ones, because they make for good portraits. Even in vehicles in Africa, most of them have multiple rows, or many of them have multiple rows at different heights. And the lower rows you don't see as much. But what you do see is kind of at eye level. So like this little guy on a termite mound, I'm in the front of the vehicle in the lowest row, and I get eye contact. If I'm in the back row, I might see more things. I'll see stuff sooner. I'll see it further away. I'll have less obstructions, but I'm going to get a little looking down on. Black and white's fun too. If you get bored, you can do infrared. I don't find it works that well with most wildlife, so I don't typically take my infrared camera with me for wildlife trips, but I'm not going to go through those stories. Here's a good example of depth of field. These two puffins are actually a foot apart in depth from me, and I'm shooting with a 600mm lens, but I knew what I wanted, and I just spun the aperture dial all the way to as close as possible and took the image and managed to get them both in pretty good focus, because I really wanted a picture of two puffins with fish in their mouths. It only took me 5 years to get it. The wind, birds like planes are going to fly a lot into the wind, and they fly a lot slower when they go into the wind. So you can have a bird that's flying 20 miles an hour into a 20-mile-an-hour wind or whatever, and it's practically hovering. So it's much easier to take bird flight shots. So set up, if you know where they're going and you know which direction the wind is, you want the sun to be going the same direction as the wind. So they'll be coming into the sun and into the wind when you shoot at them, ideally. Biology, this one won first place in the National Wildlife Federation contest, which is a pretty good payday. But I knew this Harris hawk down here was going to defend her. It wasn't her kill, it was something we put there. Defend the food, even though she wasn't hungry, against another hawk. And we just spent 4 hours to get this one picture, but it was worth it. You know, that was what we really wanted to do, was get a picture of the Harris hawks fighting. Oh, this is the tripod thing I told you about. The mother's going to look like that with her eyes facing you for 2 to 3 seconds. So, you know, you really have to be ready to get the shot if you want it. Going low, this big 1,000-pound bear, you don't do this unless you have a bear guide next to you. But I went down right on my knees, and the one blade of grass I managed to get away from, because if that had been in front of his eye, it would have kind of sucked. Oh, low light, you can still do it. Anticipation is real important. Here's an example. These meerkats, if you ever get a chance to work with any of the habituated meerkat families, it's a total hoot. But at any rate, they scurry from one mound to another, and on the way they eat whatever they find. They're pretty vicious, and they're a lot of, like, go after frogs and snakes and things like that. But I knew where they were probably going to go as the sunset hit, so I was all set up with my tripod low to the ground at about eye level. So I could have settled for like this photo. Hey, look, Mom, you know, there are all these meerkats coming towards us, but I see the road. But I got this photo in addition, which is obviously quite a bit more Africa-like. You never know. We watched these 4 young lions try and figure out how to hunt Cape buffalo for 2.5 hours. We'd given up. We were having our coffee. And they went to sleep under a bush and disturbed a mother honey badger and the little honey badger. And they all decided to go after it. One of them got the little honey badger under its paw, and the mom turned around and just went right after it. So I have a little video of the honey badgers fighting the bears. The honey badgers won. Fighting the lions, rather. Nighttime can still be, stuff happens. Yeah, just once you put it all together, you know, it makes for a shot that's unique, even with the, you know, it's a long-tailed shrike. You see them all the time, but getting it to where it's really all together. The last inch, this is the endangered western snowy plover. And I have a dog dish where I just put I put the Frisbee upside down and put my lens right down inside it and get down and lay down and push it along the ground and get this picture of a 2-inch bird that if I take it from up above, it just looks like I'm looking down at some 2-inch bird. Okay, now on to the what do we do with all those images?
The good stuff.
The good stuff, yeah. First thing is, cards have gotten pretty inexpensive, so you can use really good ones. I mean, I should have brought some out. I have these 16 megabyte cards that cost as much as a 512 gigabyte card now, and wouldn't even fit one photo. So they're really amazing. So I use the SanDisk Extreme Pro and Extreme family. I have to admit, I kind of get confused between, there's a lot of different labelings and stuff like that. But I use either the big ones for a rugged trip like Africa, or increasingly I just use the micro SDs because those work in my drones, they work in my mobile devices, and they work in my cameras with an adapter, and they work in my computer with an adapter, and I can use them for everything. So they're a little more brittle maybe, and they're not quite as fast, but they're a pretty good compromise. Now, one thing I do, I swap cards every outing. I take enough cards with me so I don't have to reuse a card. I shouldn't say it that way. I reuse them over the course of the trip. But whenever I get back, the door opens I open the door on my camera, pull out the card. I leave that door open until I put a new card in it. I never close the door on the camera until there's a card in it, because the most annoying thing is to go out, see something that you've always wanted to photograph and realize there's no card in the camera. So I do that, and then where I store the cards, the upside down ones have stuff on them, the right side up ones are fresh. And then other than that, you're on your own. You know, I think that's a pretty good system. It works pretty well. They're cheap enough to take extras. They can fail. I've actually, ironically, the ones I've had fail the most I've got these Lexars that are like super expensive. They're now called something else, but I've had more of those fail than the SanDisk. So yeah, so then in the field, a couple options. You've already seen, I think, this guy. Actually, you didn't. That was before the thing started. So this is just an external SanDisk that you can put a copy on. My computer has a terabyte drive in it, but I make a spare copy of things to here. Now, if you have a computer, that's great. If you don't have a computer with you, then a really good option is this Western Digital My Passport Wireless, because then you can put your card in, you can put the images on here, and then you can look at them on your phone or your mobile device or your computer. And then in that case, it's only one copy unless you had two of these. I would probably then not reuse the cards maybe or something, because I'm always paranoid. I always want two copies of things, but it's not strictly essential, and especially if you're not shooting, I guess, professionally. You want to be able to look at your images for a couple of reasons. One is you want to look in case there's some corruption going on. We've had issues over the past where cameras that were charged on the wrong kind of power supply started corrupting images, or firmware had problems, or you always run into something somewhere. So it's good to know if the images are really there and viewable. The other thing is you want to look and see if you're doing stuff right. Like if all your images are too dark, it's like, oh, maybe I did some setting wrong, or maybe I'm confused, or maybe my lens contacts are bad. So you really want to review your images every day if possible, or more. And then of course, marking your favorites while you're still there helps, because it's a lot to do when you get home. So once I do get home, the first thing I do is everything goes on to, in my case, a NAS. Well, they load on a local computer, and then I file onto my NAS. And I call them out. Now I use the Western Digital Red drives for the NAS. I always keep a spare around too, because I always want to make sure if a drive dies, I've got another one. And then I file onto a Synology NAS. Now for my main, you can either use that as a backup if you have enough room on your computer, or I don't, because we have close to 10 terabytes of images and videos. So I use a NAS connected over 10 gigabit as my primary workspace for my primary Photoshop computer. And that works really well. And then I have it waterfall to a second one. And then it also, from that, the Synology has software that I can then archive it either to their backup, or I use Amazon Photos and OneDrive and different places. I can put stuff up in the cloud as well. And all that software comes with a Synology, which is kind of cool. So as far as backup and archive, there's a lot of different approaches to that. One is to just waterfall locally to another server, which I do, and I think is important because you just never know if something could go wrong. I actually don't make that waterfall automatic, because I'm afraid, like if I accidentally delete a folder of images on my primary NAS, I don't want that deletion to propagate. So that particular one I run manually on a regular basis after a long editing session, and I'm pretty sure things are okay. I do a replicate. Now what I have on automatic is we actually have I have a 2-bay NAS located at our kids' house in Austin, Texas. And we each have a drive on the other one, and they've got stuff they can put on theirs, and then we have the software to back it up. And I've got stuff on mine that goes there, and I've got an article on Extreme Tech, who I write for, on how we did that. But we did that with all Synology software and 2 Synologies, and then I have the comfort of knowing I've got an offsite backup for free, without having to pay anybody anything, and it's always there. And if I need it, I can log into it, or they could log in, or they could mail it back to me, or whatever, which is pretty cool. And now Synology has another cool option for that. That little one you see there is actually only this big, and it has 6 bays that take 2.5-inch drives. And I've got right now 8 terabytes filling up the first 4 of these, giving me 6 terabytes of usable space, which is enough for my image library. So I could take my images anywhere in the world, or in case of here, we have fire season. This is a great thing. I can just grab this and take it in case of fire season. So that's pretty cool.
And those are SSDs inside of that one, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think, and it'll take HDs, but as we discussed for mobile, the SSDs are more rugged.
Yep.
So if I wanted to take this, if I'm in Africa for a month and I need to take my library and work with it, I would want the SSDs for sure. These these guys, I don't have an actual drive because they're inside, but these Western Digital SA 500s, I think they're 2 terabytes each in my case. Yeah, and backup isn't the same as archive either. I mean, think about that in terms of like an archive, you might want to keep everything ever. Like I said, so in case you delete something, backup is more, you know, what have I done today? There's a lot of different strategies that I've written about, and these guys all have webinars on it that are great. But it is pretty important. You don't want to lose this stuff. I can't believe how many people just have all their pictures on a Mac. Or like MacBook, and then the MacBook drive crashes and like, how do I get my photos back? It's like, you don't have a backup, but you know, something to think about. And that was pretty much my formal presentation. I've got some more cool slides here. The grizzly bear. This is Yellowstone in the, well, it's in the winter, although this particular picture doesn't have a lot of snow, but he's got some, no, actually this is in the summer. Oh, some little guy there, pronghorn.
We have this question coming in from Facebook. Joel, thanks for joining us here. He's saying he recently bought the Sigma 150 to 600 lens. Mm-hmm. From your recommendations, what would you recommend on how to calibrate it so it doesn't focus too soft?
Okay, well, there's a USB hub. I mean, first of all, the first thing I think you need to do is see if it's too soft or it's wrong. So in other words, you take your beer bottles or whatever, Coke bottles, and put them up on the wall, and you pick the one you're focusing on, and then you see if it's the sharpest thing in the scene, or you can use a little data color ruler. So if the sharpest thing in the scene is what you're focusing on and it's not sharp enough, then either it's probably not the lens for you because it's not as sharp as you want, or it has a problem with the lens. If the issue is that something in front or behind is sharper, then Sigma sells a USB little ring adapter guy that goes on it, and they give you software that you can play with, and you can actually change the focus and say, okay, you know, it's focusing in front or in back.
Awesome. I think I personally wanted to just say one of the things that I appreciated greatly that you mentioned, and this is a lot of flack that I get from my coworkers all the time, but you mentioned about and repeated a lot of times, I think that, you know, it's really about what gear you have currently. It's not about what gear you want or, you know, what gear you're planning on getting or hoping to getting. You know, I think that's really important for everybody watching to not get caught up with that. Whatever you've got currently and whatever you have available at your disposal is really the best utensil, so to speak, to grab that shot and grab that photo and capture it. Because at the end of the day, if it's, you know, your smartphone or no photo, you know, you take whatever you can get. So I personally appreciate all the support you're giving me to take that ammo back to, you know, my coworkers and rub it in their face a little bit and say, see, I told you guys.
There you go. Well, I think that actually brings up another question I get a lot is like, oh, should I buy this new thing? And the first thing I then ask is, what problem are you trying to solve? Like, what photo do you think you cannot get now that you think that piece of equipment is going to let you get? And often people haven't done the thought experiment, like, oh, I need another 100 millimeters of telephoto. Okay, well, let's look at your images and we'll crop them down by 4/5. Now, you know, okay, that's what you're going to get. Now, is that making you happier? Oh, well, it's still not sharp. It's like, oh, well, that's a different problem. You know, like, let's back up a bit. You know, now, why isn't it sharp? Is it because of your technique? Is it because of your camera? Is it because of the lens? And diagnosing things, I think, is super critical. And I've written, actually, back when I used to write for PC Magazine, I wrote a bunch of articles on that are still on the web somewhere on troubleshooting your images. But just going through a checklist, just like if your computer isn't working. And that's one thing, obviously, you go on a professionally led safari, you hope the photographer, it's one of the things you're paying for is have somebody there to diagnose and work with you on what's wrong. Because otherwise you can freak out. Just like if your computer doesn't work, it's like, Well, my computer doesn't work. Like, okay, well, let's figure it out. And same for my images are too soft or the color's wrong. Maybe your monitor's not calibrated. We don't have to so much anymore, but we used to bring all the data color spiders and calibrate everybody's monitor the first day because people would be looking at their shots afterward and go, my camera's broken, my images aren't as bright as his. It's like, well, that's because you have this Lenovo low-end thing that's calibrated to make PowerPoint look good. And he's got a MacBook Pro that comes out of the factory pre-calibrated to make photos look good. You know, we can slam a spider on yours and in 20 minutes, your image looks like his, more or less.
Excellent, excellent. And then we're gonna get to wrapping it up here with Betty coming in. She would like to know, where do you shoot the bears in water? Specifically, where in Alaska, or shooting the spirit bears?
Yeah, I don't know anything about shooting the spirit bears. The best areas I've found to photograph brown bears, which are also kind of the same as grizzly bears, except bigger, and Kodiak bears, which are the same, except they eat more fish, but is in that Cook Inlet area. You can down by Admiralty Island, I don't know anything about that, but in the Cook Inlet area, there's some places on Kodiak that are really good. There's some places in Katmai National Park that are really good. And the place we go is Silver Salmon Creek Lodge in Lake Clark National Park, which just has a beautiful combination of a really small lodge with really good food that's right in the middle of the bears. So some of the other places are either you're in a boat or in a tent, or it's not that fun, but there's lots of opportunities around that Cook Inlet area once you get away from the people and you're near the water by definition.
Awesome. Excellent. And so I would like to say thank you very much, David, for joining us today. I think there was a ton of knowledge that you shared with everybody, and we've got a ton of messages that said, thank you so much for everything that you shared with us. I want to thank our sponsors, Western Digital, as well as Synology. David, is there a place where people can find your work, can follow along with you? If they want to reach out to you?
Yeah, cardinalphoto.com. And we're also on Facebook as Cardinal Photo. And some polar bears. There we go. What else I was going to say about that? Yeah, cardinalphoto.com, Facebook, Twitter, David Cardinal, but I don't answer that too much. But those two places are a pretty good start.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another event here at the B&H Virtual Event Space. Thanks, David, for sticking with us. Pete from Western Digital, we appreciate having you here. Always great to see you. And Synology as well for sponsoring the event today. Until we see you again, looking forward to it. Have a great night.